The place that was set for someone else, Margaret Holloway, was 58 years old when she inherited Wether Crag, and the solicitor in Hexham told her there was a condition attached to the house that she ought to hear before she signed. She had been expecting some small thing. A clause about the housekeeper's continued employment, perhaps, or a request that her aunt's books not be sold. What Mr Pelham read out to her was neither of those. On the 7th evening of November in every year that the inheritor holds the house, the inheritor shall prepare and set, at the long table in the dining room of Wether Crag, a place for one additional person. A plate, a knife and a fork, a glass, a napkin, and a chair drawn out by approximately a hand's breadth. A proper meal shall be placed on the plate. A glass of water shall be poured. From the hour of 7 in the evening until the first light of the following morning, the dining room shall not be entered. The door shall be closed. The inheritor shall not, during these hours, look into the room. In the morning the inheritor shall clear the place away, regardless of what is found. The inheritor shall not speak of the custom to anyone outside the household, and shall pass it, in due course, to the next inheritor on the same terms. Margaret listened to the reading without interrupting. When he had finished, she asked him what would happen if the custom were not kept. He said he did not know. He had asked her aunt that question once, perhaps 15 years ago, and her aunt had said she did not know either and did not wish to find out. She had said that the not knowing, after some years of keeping the custom, had become the point of it. Margaret asked who had set the custom in the first place. Mr Pelham said the family records did not say. Adela had received it from her great-uncle Thomas in 1859, and Thomas had received it from someone before him, and the trail stopped there. The custom was older than any living memory of its origin. There had been, in the muniments at the house, a single sheet of paper in a hand from perhaps the 17th century, which had set out the same conditions in older language. The paper was the oldest record. There was nothing earlier. Margaret asked whether she could refuse. Mr Pelham said she could. The house would pass to a cousin in Carlisle whom Margaret had never met. The cousin would be told the same conditions and would make his own decision. If he refused as well, the estate would be sold and the proceeds divided according to the residuary clause. He did not, he said, recommend her refusal one way or the other. He said only that her aunt had given the matter 43 years of her life and had judged it worth keeping for every one of them. Margaret sat in the chair across from his desk and thought. She thought about her aunt. She had met Adela 4 times in 58 years and could not, with any confidence, picture her face. She thought about her own house in Newcastle, the narrow front parlour where she had sat alone every evening for 6 winters now, since her husband had died of pneumonia. The rooms she had walked through every day with the soft sense of being slightly in the way of their emptiness. She thought about a fell she had never seen and a house she had never visited, and about a woman she barely remembered who had lived in the house alone for 43 years and had not, by any account Margaret had ever heard, complained. She thought also about the custom itself, a place at a table, a meal, a closed door for 1 night a year. It did not, on its face, ask very much. Whatever it actually was, it was less labour than the running of her own kitchen in Newcastle. She was, she found, more curious than she was afraid. She signed. Mr Pelham countersigned. He filed the papers. At the door of his office, as she was leaving, he stopped her and said one further thing. He said that he had known Adela for 20 years, and that she had been an entirely sensible woman, of no superstitious temperament, who had nevertheless kept the custom every year of her adult life. He said this fact had impressed itself on him over the years. He said he was not telling Margaret what to believe. He was telling her only to give the custom the weight her aunt had given it, at least until she had reason to do otherwise. Margaret said she would. Wether Crag stood on the shoulder of a fell 11 miles north of Hexham, reached by a track that the hired trap would not take her up. Margaret walked the last half-mile carrying a small case, with her trunk to follow by farm cart the next day. The wind came down the fell against her, and she stopped twice to rest, and to look out over the country she was climbing into. It was open and brown and empty. There were no trees. A few sheep grazed in the middle distance and lifted their heads as she passed and went back to whatever they had been doing. By the time she reached the top of the track, the light was already going thin, and the house, when it came into view, was a darker grey than the grey of the sky behind it. It was longer and lower than she had pictured. 2 stories, dark grey stone, slate roof, 4 chimneys. The windows were small and deep-set, and the front of the building had the watchful look of a thing put on the fell long ago to keep an eye on the country below. There was no garden. There was no fence. There was only the house, and a single small stone byre at its side, and the brown land falling away in every direction. There was no smoke from any of the chimneys. The housekeeper had come up that morning to open the windows and had gone back down to the village to give Margaret her arrival in private. The front door was on the latch. Margaret pushed it open and stepped inside. The entrance hall was narrow, flagged, white-walled. The cold of the house was the kind of cold that does not leave a building in winter even when the fires are lit, the cold that lives in the stones. A stair rose on the right. A door on the left stood open to a sitting room. A door at the end of the hall stood open to the kitchen. The third door, on the right of the hall just before the stair, was closed. That was the dining room. She knew it without being told. She did not, on her first afternoon, open it. She went through the rest of the house. The sitting room was modest. 2 chairs by a small grate, a writing desk by the window, a low shelf of perhaps 40 books. The kitchen was clean and well-stocked, with a fire that the housekeeper had banked before leaving, and that Margaret built up again with the practiced hands of a woman who had kept her own fires for 40 years. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. One had been Adela's, made up for her now in fresh linen. One had been the housekeeper's, a smaller room above the kitchen. The third, at the end of the upper passage, was entirely bare boards, a single small window, no furniture, and Margaret looked in once and saw no reason to come back. She took her supper at the kitchen table. Bread, cheese, tea. She sat an hour in the sitting room with one of her aunt's books, a volume of essays on the natural history of the North Country. The wind, against the small, deep-set window, rose a little after dark and then dropped again. She built up the fire. She went to bed at 9:30 in her aunt's old bed and slept the night through. The door of the dining room she did not, in the whole of the first day, open. She opened it the next morning, before the housekeeper was due, because she did not wish another person to be present when she first saw the room. The dining room was longer than it was wide. The table ran most of its length, a heavy oak piece that must have been built where it stood. There was no door wide enough to have brought it in afterward. 8 chairs around it, 4 to each long side, with a 9th at the head and a 10th at the foot. The chairs were pushed in. The 2 windows along the eastern wall let in a thin grey light. There was no fireplace. The room was perceptibly colder than the rest of the house. The chairs on the long side facing the windows were not, when Margaret looked at them carefully, all alike. They were the same chairs, made by the same hand, but one of them, the third along, counting from the head, was different in the ways a chair becomes different when it has been used. The seat was smoother than the seats of the others. The wood at the top of the back was darker, in a faint oval the size of a head. The arms had small worn places where hands had rested. The chair had been sat in regularly over many years by something that had a head, and that had hands, and that had spent enough time at the table to leave the marks any body leaves. Margaret stood in the doorway and looked at it for some time. She did not, then, go into the room. She closed the door and went back to the kitchen and put on the kettle for the housekeeper. Mrs. Eccles arrived at 10. She was 60 or so, broad-shouldered, quiet in the face, with the deliberate movements of a woman who had spent her life in houses where deliberate movement was the only kind that did not disturb things. She accepted the cup of tea Margaret offered her and sat down at the kitchen table opposite her. She answered Margaret's questions about the running of the house in short, clear sentences. The grazing tenant. The schedule of her own attendance, which had been 3 mornings a week with Adela, and which she said could be more or less as Margaret wished. The location of the village sharp. The post. When Margaret had finished the practical questions, she set down her cup and said she would like to ask about the custom as well. Mrs. Eccles looked at her for a long moment. "I served your aunt 19 years, she said. "I helped her prepare the meal 19 times. I left this house at 7 on every 7th of November in those 19 years and walked down to the village, and I came back up the next morning at the usual time. I never saw the room between 7 and dawn. I never asked her what she saw. She told me one thing about it once in the 8th year, and I have remembered it. She said the custom was an exercise in being a person who did not need to know. She said the keeping of it had made her that kind of person, and that she had come to believe this was, in itself, the point. Margaret asked whether her aunt had ever broken the custom. Not in my 19 years. Not by anything she ever said to me in any of the years before. Had anyone she knew? Mrs. Eccles looked into her cup. She seemed to consider for some seconds whether to answer at all. The great uncle who left her the house, she said. Thomas. She told me about him once, late in her life, when she was in a different mood than the one she usually was in. He looked, the 1st November he held the house. He did not speak of what he saw. He kept the custom every November after, for the rest of his life, but he was not the same man after the first one. Your aunt said her mother had told her so, who had known him before. He had been a cheerful man before the inheritance. He was not a cheerful man after. He lived another 28 years in this house. He spoke very little in any of them. And your aunt, she did not look. She did not look. She used to say, when the 7th of November was coming, that she had her great uncle to thank for the not looking. She said she had grown up with the picture of him sitting silent in the corner of her grandmother's parlour, and that the picture had been warning enough. And you, Mrs. Eccles, would you look? Mrs. Eccles set down her cup. I am not the keeper of the house, madam. The keeper of the house has the choice. I do not. I leave the house at 7 and I come back at first light, and what passes between is between the keeper and whatever it is that comes. I have my own kind of not knowing. It has done me no harm in 19 years. She did not say any more about it. Margaret did not press her. The first week of November came on slowly. Margaret unpacked the trunk that the man with the cart brought up the next afternoon. She put her own books on the shelf alongside her aunt's. She walked on the fell in the afternoons and found the brown, empty country less lonely than she had expected. The wind that came down off the higher ground had a clean, steady quality she had not felt in Newcastle in 18 years. She wrote a letter to her son in South Africa, telling him she had arrived safely and that the house was a comfortable one. She did not mention the custom in the letter. She did not, in any letter she wrote that week, mention it. She had given her word at the solicitor's office that she would not speak of it outside the household, and the word held her even in the writing of letters to her own son. She thought about Thomas in those days. A cheerful man before, not cheerful after, sitting silent in the corner of his sister's parlour for 28 years. She tried to picture him and could not, because she had no picture to work from, only the shape of a life that had been altered by a single evening, and had then, somehow, absorbed the alteration and gone on for decades. It was the going on that struck her. He had not been destroyed. He had not fled the house. He had kept the rule for the rest of his life, in the room where he had broken it, with whatever knowledge the breaking had given him, sitting in the chair across from him at the table on every 7th of November after. There was a discipline in that which Margaret recognized. It was the discipline of a person who had paid the price of a thing and had decided, having paid it, to remain in the room and finish what he had begun. She did not, in the first week, decide what she thought of him. She only thought about him. She thought also, more than she had expected to, about her aunt's not looking. She thought about a woman of 32 arriving at this house in 1859, 3 months after her great-uncle's death, and finding the rule waiting for her, and keeping it the 1st November and the 2nd and the 43rd without breaking it once. She thought about the picture Mrs. Eccles had given her, the silent man in the corner of the parlour, and about how that picture must have sat in her aunt's mind every 7th of November of her life. The picture had been a kind of inheritance too. It had passed from a sister to a daughter to a niece, the silent man, the warning, the unbroken example of what looking cost. Margaret had not, before coming to Wether Crag, ever received such a picture. She had only the will and the solicitor's careful courtesy and the housekeeper's 19 years of not asking. She wondered, in the first week, whether that was enough. On the morning of the 7th, Mrs. Eccles came up early. She brought from the village a piece of mutton wrapped in paper and a half loaf of bread fresh from the village oven. She had said the previous day that she would bring these things. Margaret had had the rest of what was needed in the kitchen already. She had also, the afternoon before, gone into the dining room for the second time, to take down from the sideboard cupboard the plate, and the cutlery, and the glass, and the napkin that were to be used. These were a separate set, older make, slightly heavier in the hand than the kitchen plates, and a single linen napkin with an embroidered M in one corner that Margaret took to be her aunt's mother's initial rather than her aunt's own. She had washed them in hot water and dried them carefully and set them ready on the kitchen dresser. She and Mrs. Eccles prepared the meal in the kitchen through the late afternoon. The mutton roasted slowly, the potatoes boiled. A small dish of cabbage was prepared with butter and pepper. Bread was sliced. The kitchen filled with the ordinary good smell of a winter supper. They worked mostly in silence. The work was the work that Margaret had done in her own kitchen perhaps 4,000 times in her life, and the knownness of the work carried her through what would otherwise have been a strange afternoon. Once or twice she caught Mrs. Eccles watching her, and once Mrs. Eccles said, "Your aunt liked the cabbage cooked longer than that, but I think you have it right." At 6:45, Margaret carried the plate and the glass and the cutlery and the napkin into the dining room. She laid the place at the worn chair on the long side of the table that faced the windows. Napkin to the left of the plate, knife and fork on either side, glass above the knife. She drew the chair out from the table by a hand's breadth, the way the will had said. She went back to the kitchen. At 7:10, she and Mrs. Eccles brought the food in. Mutton on the plate, potatoes beside the mutton, a small spoonful of cabbage, a slice of bread on the edge of the plate. Margaret poured water into the glass. She stepped back. The place was set. The chair was drawn out. The food was on the plate. Everything was as the will required. Mrs. Eccles put on her coat. She wished Margaret a quiet night. She said she would be back in the morning at the usual hour. She went out by the front door without further ceremony, and Margaret stood at the window of the sitting room and watched her go down the track in the failing light until she was out of sight at the first turning. Margaret closed the door of the dining room. She heard the small sound of her own hand on the latch, and then nothing else. The room behind the door was, in its silence, the same room it had been before she closed the door. There was no change in the air. There was no shift in the weight of the house. There was only a closed door in an ordinary passage in an ordinary house on a fell in the north of England on the 7th evening of November. She went to the kitchen. She ate the small supper she had made for herself from what was left of the mutton, a piece of bread, a cup of tea. She ate it slowly, sitting at the kitchen table, looking out the small window at nothing in particular. The light went off the fell. The wind dropped after sunset. She washed her plate. She built up the fire in the sitting room. She sat down with a book. In the first hour she did not hear anything from the dining room. She had thought she would. She had thought the chair would scrape, or the glass would lift, or there would be the small noise of cutlery on a plate, or there would be footsteps. There was nothing. The house was entirely silent. The fire in the sitting room grate made the small sounds a fire makes. Otherwise the house was as silent as Margaret had ever known a house to be. She read. After some time she realized she had read the same page 3 times without taking in what was on it, and she set the book down. She thought about Thomas. A cheerful man before, not cheerful after. She thought about her aunt, who had kept the rule for 43 years and who had said in the 8th year that the keeping of the custom was an exercise in being a person who did not need to know. She thought about the worn chair on the long side of the table, and about the head that had darkened the wood at the top of the back, and about what the head belonged to. In the second hour the wanting started. It was not a strong wanting. It was a small, steady curiosity, of the kind any sensible woman might feel in the same position, the kind the will had foreseen and forbidden her to act upon. She recognized it. She set it aside. She picked up the book again. In the third hour the wanting was still there. It had not grown. It had only not gone away. It sat in the back of her mind the way a kettle sits on a hob, not boiling, only present, only warming. In the fourth hour, perhaps a little after 11, Margaret got up from the chair and went out into the passage. She had told herself, getting up, that she was only going to look at the door. There would be no harm in looking at the door. The will had said she was not to enter the room and not to look into it. It had not said she could not stand in the passage. She would stand for a moment, only in the passage, and she would look at the closed door, and then she would go back to the sitting room and put the matter away. She stood outside the door of the dining room. The passage was dim, lit only by the open doorway of the sitting room behind her. The door of the dining room was a closed door. There was no light beneath it. The lamp inside had been put out at 7. There was no sound from behind it, but the flagstones in front of the door were warm. She felt the warmth through her stockings before she understood what she was feeling. The stones of the passage were cold and had been cold all evening. They were the same stones as the stones in the kitchen and the entrance hall, and they were the temperature stones in a house on a fell in November are at midnight, which is to say very cold. The few inches of stone immediately in front of the dining room door were not. They were the temperature of stones that have had a body near them for several hours. There was no fire in the dining room. There had never been a fire in the dining room. The warmth was the warmth of something sitting, a few feet on the other side of the door, where the worn chair was. She stood very still. She listened. She did not hear anything. The room behind the door was as silent as it had been all evening, but the warmth on the stones was the warmth of a body, and the body was, by every available indication, in the chair she had drawn out for it. She put her hand on the latch. She did not turn it at first. She held it. She felt the cold iron of the latch under her palm, and she thought of Thomas, who had stood in this same passage in some year before her birth, and had put his hand on this same latch, and had turned it. She thought of him keeping the custom for the rest of his life with the knowledge he had got that night. She thought of her aunt keeping it for 43 years without the knowledge, and being, by every account, the steadier of the two. She thought she had a choice in this moment that was the choice her great uncle had made one way and her aunt had made the other, and that whichever way she made it would shape the rest of her life. She turned the latch. She opened the door. The room was dark. The lamp had been out for 4 hours. The only light was the dim light from the sitting room down the passage behind her, which reached as far as the doorway and not much further. Margaret could see the near edge of the table, the corner of the place she had set, the plate, the glass, the cutlery. She could see the worn chair on the long side. The chair was occupied. She could not see, in the dim light, what was sitting in it. She could see the shape of something sitting there, leaning slightly forward as though over the plate, head bent. She could see no face. She could not have said whether there was a face. The shape was the shape of a person at a meal, but it was the shape only, as though a person had been drawn in the air in the same dark grey as the room, and could be seen only because it was very slightly darker than what was behind it. It did not move when the door opened. It did not turn its head. For perhaps 3 seconds Margaret stood in the doorway and looked at it, and it did not, in those 3 seconds, give any sign that it knew she was there. Then it turned its head. It turned its head slowly, the way a person turns who has been interrupted at something and is deciding whether to be irritated by the interruption. And Margaret saw, in the dim grey of the room, the suggestion of a face turning toward her. She did not, then or after, see features. She saw only that the face turned, and that it was now oriented toward her rather than toward the plate, and that whatever was where the eyes should have been was, despite the dimness and the distance, looking at her. It did not move otherwise. It did not stand up. It did not speak. It only sat in the chair and looked at her, with the slight forward lean it had had when it was looking at the plate, and the look was the look of something that had been received as a guest for an unknown number of years in this house, and had been undisturbed in its reception, and was now being disturbed. She closed the door. She did not run. She closed the door with the same hand that had opened it, in the same slow motion, and she stepped back from the door, and she turned and walked back along the passage to the sitting room, and she went in, and she closed the sitting room door behind her, and she sat down in the chair by the fire. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on her knees and held them still. She sat there until first light. She did not hear anything from the passage in the hours that followed. She did not hear the dining room door open. She did not hear a chair pushed back or footsteps or anything else. The house, after the look, was as quiet as it had been before. The fire burned down. She did not build it up. She sat in the chair with her hands on her knees, and she watched the window, and the light came at last, grey and thin, and the fell beyond the window was the brown shoulder it had been the day before. She got up. She put on her shoes. She went out into the passage. The flagstones in front of the dining room door were cold. She put her hand on the latch and opened the door. The room was empty. The place was as she had left it. The plate, the glass, the cutlery, the napkin, the food had not been eaten. The water had not been drunk. The chair was sat in. She could see now, in the morning light, the small flatness on the seat cushion that had been there yesterday too, and a faint dullness at the top of the back where a head had rested. By every visible measure the room was as it had been after every November Adela had kept the custom, and after every November Thomas had kept it for 50 years before her. There was no sign that anything had turned its head. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long moment. She thought about closing the door and going back to the kitchen and pretending, to herself for the rest of the day and to Mrs. Eccles when she came up the track, that the night had been an ordinary night. She thought about it. She decided not to. The knowing was already in her. Pretending it was not would be the first lie of a long string of lies, and she was, at 58, too old to start a habit of that kind. She went into the room. She gathered the plate and the glass and the cutlery and the napkin. She carried them to the kitchen. She emptied the food into the bin for the village farmer's pig. She washed everything in hot water. She dried it. She put it back in the sideboard cupboard. She pushed the chair back in to match the others. She closed the door of the dining room. She heard Mrs. Eccles's step on the track outside 10 minutes later. She put the kettle on. Mrs. Eccles came in. She took her coat off in the entrance hall, the way she always did. She hung it on the peg. She came into the kitchen. She looked at Margaret once, very briefly, the way she had looked at her on the first morning in the doorway when she had been deciding whether to admit her. She did not say anything. She sat down at the kitchen table opposite Margaret. Margaret poured the tea. They drank it. After a while, Mrs. Eccles said there were sheets to be washed, and Margaret said there were, and they got on with the morning's work. It was perhaps a week later, on a wet afternoon when Mrs. Eccles had come up for her usual visit, and they were sitting in the kitchen with cups of tea between them, that Mrs. Eccles said the one thing she said about it. "My aunt was housekeeper here before me, madam, 41 years. She told me one thing about the keepers who had looked. She said they were quieter people after. Not unhappy, necessarily. Not broken. Only quieter. She said that of your great-uncle Thomas, who she had served 2 years before he died, and she said it of one keeper before him, whose name I have forgotten, who held the house in the 1820s and looked in his second November. My aunt said it was not the looking itself that did it. It was the having seen. She said the having seen is a thing you carry after, and you carry it more quietly than you carried what you were carrying before. Margaret said she thought she understood. Mrs. Eccles drank her tea. She said no more about it. She did not, in the 8 years she continued to serve Margaret before her own death, mention the matter again. Margaret kept the custom for the next 21 years. She kept it every 7th of November, in the same form she had kept it the first time. She prepared the meal. She laid the place. She drew the chair out. She closed the door at 7. She did not, in any of those 21 years, go out into the passage during the night. She had stood in the passage once and had opened the door once, and the wanting that had taken her into the passage that first November did not, in any of the 21 Novembers that followed, return. It had been a wanting answered. The thing in the chair had looked back at her. The looking had been the answer. The answer did not require to be asked again. She thought about what she had seen perhaps 1,000 times in the years that followed. She did not, in any of those 1,000 thinkings, work out what she had seen. The shape had been the shape of a person at a meal. The turning had been the turning of a head. The looking had been the looking of something that had been interrupted and was deciding what to do about it. None of these descriptions, when she set them down, brought her any closer to knowing what had actually been in the chair. She came, after the first 5 or 6 years, to stop trying. The not knowing her aunt had described, which had been the gift the custom gave to the keeper who did not look, was not available to her in its original form. She had a different not knowing instead. She had seen the shape, and she did not know what the shape was, and this was a colder and harder not knowing than the one her aunt had carried. But it was, she came to think, still a kind of not knowing, and she could live in it. She came also, over the years, to a kind of agreement with the thing. She had broken the rule the first November. She had been seen looking, by something that did not, by any other available evidence, wish to be looked at. She had closed the door, and she had not, since, broken the rule again. The thing had not, in any year afterward, given her any reason to think it held the breaking against her. The chair was sat in each year. The place was undisturbed. The mornings of the 8th of November were as they had always been. Whatever had turned its head to look at her in the November of 1902 had, in some way she could not articulate, but believed she could feel, accepted that the look had been the look, and that she would not repeat it, and had gone back to being what it had been before, a guest at a long table, in a dark room, for one night a year, in a house on a fell that did not, in any year that mattered, require to know what it was. She thought she understood her great uncle better in the years after. He had been a cheerful man before. He had not been a cheerful man after. Margaret was not, in the strict sense, cheerful after either. She was a woman who had seen something she should not have seen, and had spent the rest of her life keeping the rule she had once broken, and the keeping had a different quality than it would have had if she had never broken it. It had the quality of a debt being paid down in small installments, year by year, against the day when the keeper would either die or pass the house to the next keeper, and the debt would, with whatever it amounted to, transfer to the next account. She did not regret the looking exactly. She did not also recommend it. It had given her a knowledge she could not share, that she could not act on, that she could not put down. It had given her, in the way her aunt's instruction to her own successor had not warned, an inheritance heavier than the house. She wrote to her granddaughter in the last year of her life the letter her aunt had not written to her. The custom is to be kept, the rule is to be honored. There will be a wanting in the first November you keep it that will take you out into the passage. When it does, turn around. Go back to the sitting room. Sit by the fire. I did not turn around, and I have lived with what I saw for 22 years, and I would not wish it on you. The wanting will pass if you do not feed it. The not knowing is the gift the custom gives you. Do not give it back. She died at 79, in the winter of 1923, of a small steady decline that the village doctor attributed to age, and nothing more particular than age. She died in her bed, in the room that had been her aunt's. Mrs. Burton, who had taken Mrs. Eccles's place 6 years before, found her in the morning. The doctor came up. The younger Mr. Pelham came up from Hexham the next day with the papers. The house went to her son's eldest daughter, Elena, a young woman of 22 who had walked the fell with her grandmother once and had asked her almost no questions. Elena came to Hexham in the second week of November to sign the papers. The keys were on the desk in front of her, and beside the keys was the sealed letter Margaret had left with Mr. Pelham 4 months before. Elena read the letter in the office. She read it twice. She did not, the second time, weep, though she had wept a little the first time. She folded the letter and put it inside her glove. She signed the papers. She took the keys. She drove up to Wether Crag that same afternoon in a hired trap that left her at the foot of the track. She walked the last half-mile carrying a small case, the way her grandmother had walked it 21 years before. The wind came down the fell against her. The house, when it came into view at the top of the track, was longer and lower than her childhood memory had made it. Dark grey stone, slate roof, 4 chimneys, small deep-set windows. There was no smoke from any of the chimneys. The door was on the latch. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The entrance hall was narrow, flagged, white-walled. A stair rose on the right. A door on the left stood open to a sitting room. A door at the end of the hall stood open to the kitchen. The third door, on the right of the hall just before the stair, was closed. She did not, on her first afternoon, open it. In some part of the fells of northern England, in a small fold of high ground that does not appear on any map a traveller is likely to use, Wether Crag presumably continues to stand. The keeper, whoever she is now, presumably continues, on the 7th evening of November in each year, to set the place. The chair is drawn out. The door is closed at 7. The keeper sits, through the deep hours of the night, in the sitting room across the passage. She does not go out into the passage, because she has been warned by a letter from a woman who learned the cost. What sits at the table on those nights has been seen. It does not need to be seen again. May the houses on the high fells always be kept by women who can sit through a night by a fire and not get up. May the letters that pass from one keeper to the next always be written in the plain language Margaret Holloway wrote hers in. May the wanting, in the 1st November, always pass. Good night.